Hi, my name's Chelsea. Welcome to Raising Healthy Families workshop, Understanding Trauma. Today we are going to just do a basic overview of some things that may cause trauma. With that, there's three main types, and we're going to discuss that a little bit. Then we're going to go over some signs and symptoms you may see of a child who's experienced trauma. And then we'll wrap up with some ways that you can support or assist a child that's been through traumatic experience. Thank you for joining me today. The information that's being shared today may be a little bit triggering for some people, so if it is and you find yourself being heightened, please just take the time and practice some healthy self-care. In addition to that, if you feel the need for extra supports, please feel free to reach out to a mental health professional and get the supports that you need. Okay, thank you. So we're going to start off today by defining a traumatic event. So what is a traumatic event? Well, it is a single event or multiple incidences that causes physical, emotional, spiritual, or psychological harm to an individual. The person experiencing the distressing event may feel threatened, anxious, or frightened as a result. In some cases, they may not know how to respond, or they may be in denial that the event happened at all. The person who's experienced a traumatic event will need some support and time to recover and regain emotional and mental stability. Now, one thing about trauma is that you don't get to decide if an event was traumatic for another person or not. It is an individual's perception. So if you think that perhaps your child or your friend or family member went through something that they label or are reacting to in a traumatic way, then that's the way that their brain is perceiving that it's a threat to themselves. And so you don't get to say whether that's traumatic for them or not. It's really based on an individual's perception. Okay, so what are some things that could cause trauma? Well, child abuse in any form can be very traumatic. Being in war or combat, that's the one we most think of when we hear post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. A serious illness causing medical trauma or emotional trauma, parental abandonment, moving to a new location, witnessing a death, domestic violence, a death of a family member, a friend, a pet, a teacher. And in addition to that, there's many other things that can cause trauma, but we're going to move into discussing a few types of trauma. So there are three main types of trauma. The first is acute trauma. So this is kind of a one-time instance. It can come in the form of a car accident, a natural disaster, a single event of abuse, witnessing a violent event, and that has an impact on the individual's physical or emotional safety. Okay, these instances can leave a lasting negative impact on a person if left untreated and unsupported. Acute trauma is also sometimes connected to short-term post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. Our second type of trauma is chronic trauma, and this may be made up of several instances of an acute trauma experience. So perhaps child abuse, domestic violence, experiencing war or combat situations. Chronic trauma can actually also be made up of several different types of acute trauma events occurring one after another in a short period of time. Our third type of trauma is complex trauma, and this is typically results from exposure to multiple and varied instances of multiple traumatic events or experiences within the context of interpersonal relationships. So for example, it involves feeling trapped is often extreme, ongoing, repeated. This is typically what children, multiple situations can cause complex trauma in childhood, including all forms of child abuse, neglect, adverse childhood experiences, community violence, domestic violence situations, civil unrest, war trauma, cultural dislocation, sexual exploitation, and trafficking. So that's our three main types. Okay, so let's discuss a little bit about child reactions to trauma. Children can react to trauma in a lot of different ways. So they may have symptoms of depression, anxiety, dissociation, or even have PTSD. That's the post-traumatic stress disorder, which we'll discuss a little bit later. Their caregivers may have a difficult time with those events, as well as their children's reactions. Often we see a lot of behaviors kind of crop up in children that have experienced trauma. And if the caregiver has also experienced trauma and is having a difficult time coping, it can lead to kind of a rough connection between caregiver and child. So if we know what we may see in our children and some ways to help support them, it can really smooth the family dynamic. So let's discuss a few things that we may see. We may see fear and anxiety. So this is a pretty common one in children. Anxiety symptoms can include hyperactivity and difficulty concentrating, looking a lot like ADHD actually. Fear symptoms can usually include the child being fearful of certain situations, such as perhaps around bedtime or bathing. It's typically a fear it's typically a fear connected to the traumatic event. You also may see some aggression in children. Children who are abused or have been through a traumatic event can be aggressive, angry, hostile, especially if they experienced physical abuse or witnessed violence. Another thing you may see is sexualized behaviors. Children who have experienced sexual trauma may exhibit over-sexualized behaviors. So meaning they show or recreate the trauma in their play, or they show too many signs about knowing too much or not age-appropriate information regarding sex. Children also may show some signs of avoiding. Sometimes children will try to avoid thinking about or doing anything that may remind them of the traumatic event. They might seem sad or withdrawn, or they may even seem extra happy because their avoidance is really working. Another concerning sign is difficulty connecting or relating to others. So children that have gone through trauma may have trouble with relationships, maintaining relationships. For example, they may be very aggressive towards other children or caregivers. They may cry, or they may be very clingy and demanding of a lot of attention. Okay. And our last one is PTSD symptoms, which can include some strange behaviors, kind of staring off in no reason, hallucinating, flashbacks. All of those are signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. So I'm going to talk about some age-specific signs, potential signs of trauma, okay? And I want to be very clear, just because your child is exhibiting some of these signs does not necessarily mean that they have been exposed to trauma, but it's definitely something to be aware of and have on your radar. And we'll talk about ways that we can support our children if they've been through something traumatic. So we will get there, don't worry. So let's talk about some more age-specific signs of trauma. So in your younger children, ages 0 to 5, you may see irritability or something as parents label as typically fussiness, startling easy or being it being very difficult for the child to calm, frequent tantrums, clinginess or reluctance to explore their world as they should be. Some other things could be activity level that is very high in comparison to their peers, and repeating the traumatic event over and over in play. There also tends to be a delay in reaching physical, language, or other milestones that are age appropriate. Now, in our school-age children, ages 6 to 12, there may be signs such as difficulty paying attention, being quiet or withdrawn, frequent tears or sadness, talking about scary thoughts or feelings or ideas, difficulty transitioning from one activity to the next, fighting with peers or adults, changes in school performance. If you had an A+ student and they're now failing, that may be something that needs to be looked at. Wanting to be left alone, eating much more or much less than peers, getting into frequent trouble at school or at home. We often see a lot of physical symptoms in our school-age children, such as frequent headaches, stomach aches with no apparent causes, and behaviors common to younger children. So you may see some age regression, okay, such as that thumb sucking, bedwetting, fear of the dark. For our youth, 13 to 18, you may see emotional numbing, or talking about the trauma constantly, or denying that it happened, so kind of the extremes on both ends. Refusal to follow the rules or talk back frequently. They may be tired all the time, so sleeping much more or much less than their peers. Risky behaviors, fighting, not wanting to spend time with their friends like they used to, so that withdrawal and isolation. This is an age where you may often see using drugs or alcohol to running away or getting in trouble with the law. So again, those physical somatic complaints, so those headaches, those stomach aches, academic or vocational decline, so maybe they were really into sports and now they're withdrawing, or they're now not doing as fantastic in school as they were. You may also see suicidal thoughts or self-harming behaviors. So again, that substance use and antisocial behaviors. Now I want to remind you, with these potential signs of trauma, they are potential. And just because a child is age 6 and displaying some signs that a younger child might be, doesn't mean it's not trauma, or it might not be trauma. None of this fits specifically to that age group and that age group alone. Or maybe they are displaying some sort of sign that I'm not listing here. And this is not an all-exhaustive and all-inclusive list. We are just doing an overview. In fact, we could spend many, many hours together discussing the impact, the signs, the causes of trauma, and not be all-inclusive. So this is just a very basic overview of trauma. Okay? So please keep that in mind. Now with our ages 6 to 11, it's very similar, right? We want to reassure them that we are here with them and for them. We are here to keep them safe. So keep those routines, make things quote unquote normal as possible. Those bedtimes, meal times, keep them as normal and average as possible. Consistent, right? Consistency makes comfort. Spend time talking with your child. Let them know it's okay to talk and ask questions and express their feelings. One really great way is to use mealtime. So make a family time to talk about what's happening in the family as well as the community. Maybe ask what their friends have been saying about the situation if they know. That way you can correct any misinformation. Answer questions briefly but honestly. If a child has brought something up, first ask their ideas so you can understand exactly what the concern is, right? If you don't know an answer, it is okay to say, I don't know. There's no need to speculate or repeat rumors. Making sure that our children are engaged, giving them, activities, let them play with their friends or go to school. Think of alternative activities, so organizing playgroups with other parents. Also, maybe calming worries. Find the hope. So children need to see a future to recover. Kids this age appreciate specifics. So, for example, in the event of a natural disaster, you could say, people from all over the country are sending medical supplies, food, and water. They've built new places where people who are hurt will be taken care of, and they will build new homes. It'll be very hard, but it's only like this for a little while. So, find the ways to look forward to the future. All right, and for our ages 12 to 18, that time period in a child's life is rough enough as is. Then when you add in trauma, there are so many transition and things happening, it can be overwhelming enough. And often those children feel the need to take on kind of an adult role. It's okay for them to still be a child that they are, right? So one of the things is we don't want to add too many responsibilities, especially the ones that act adult-like. It adds to their anxiety. Open the door for discussion. It's very common for those teens to clam up and not want to talk. So maybe start a conversation while you're doing an activity together, so that way the conversation doesn't feel too intense or confrontational. Again, really limit that exposure to media. Help your teen take action. So perhaps if there's a natural disaster, you can find ways to volunteer. Make sure that you're aware of substance abuse, like we talked about in those signs and ways that we can notice that maybe something's going on. This is the age range that sometimes turns to substances to kind of numb those really big feelings. So be aware of that. Help them feel helpful. So give them small tasks and praise them for what they've done and how they've handled themselves. Make them feel safe again. So they may act like they don't need that security. They may resist giving you hugs. You can help them feel secure. You can say something like, I know you're grown right now, but I need to give you a hug. I just love spending time with you, those sort of things. And be understanding, right? So find ways to come together and spend that quality, important time in together. So I would like to touch lightly on the ACEs, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences. So Kaiser Permanente did a study in the 1980s when they noticed that there was a high dropout rate in an obesity program with people that had been successful, at least initially, in their weight loss. Okay, so they had done really well at first, and then they ended up dropping out. Now, when the researchers did in-depth interviews, they discovered that childhood molestation was very common and almost always annotated with obesity. So obesity wasn't the problem. It was a protective solution for those people to their problem, which they had been keeping a secret. So they'd been keeping their past trauma kind of buried and used, not consciously, but used their weight as a protective piece. Okay, so out of that initial finding grew the ACEs study, so that Adverse Childhood Experience study, which was interested in finding and understanding the emotional experiences of children and the relationship to their mental and physical health as adults, as well as the cause of adult mortality. So the initial study was conducted at Kaiser Permanente from 1995 to 1997. More than 17,000 participants completed a standard physical examination. So they got their bodies checked, and currently they are tracking a medical status as like a baseline of the participants. This study looked at 10 different types of abuse experienced before the age of 18. Okay. The remarkable finding was that it was an accumulation of different types of childhood abuse, childhood experiences that caused the most damage. So with this, the VA created an ACEs score. So it's a little quiz, kind of taking inventory of different types of adverse childhood experiences. So they found that the higher a person's ACE score, the greater risk of chronic disease and mental illness. So ACEs are a strong predictor, or can be a strong predictor, of what happens later in life in terms of health risk, disease, and premature mortality. So ACEs determine the likelihood of the most 10 common causes of death in the US. So smoking, severe obesity, physical inactivity, depression, suicide attempt, alcoholism, illicit drug use, IV drug use, and 50 plus partners, STDs. Okay. So what do we take out of this? So the two most important findings of these adverse childhood experiences is that they are vastly more common than recognized or acknowledged. And they have a powerful relation to adult health. A half a century time later. So time doesn't heal these experiences. So when we talk about ACEs and think about those adverse childhood experiences, we really want to think, how has that affected you later in life? So too often those adverse childhood experiences are often very covered up, right? They're covered in that shame, that secrecy, that social taboo, and the like. This really is showing a very covered up truth about our childhood. And it's amazing, the correlation of adverse childhood experiences and your health later in life. So for example, with an adverse childhood experience score of 4, your risk for heart disease is 2 times greater, and your risk for abusing alcohol is 5 times greater than those with less than 4 adverse childhood experiences. Okay. There is an amazing TED Talk by Dr. Nadine Burke, and she discussed the correlation and the impact of adverse childhood experiences. If this is something that you're interested in, I highly suggest that you check her out. I'm not going to administer the adverse childhood experiences test because this can be very impactful on people, and I have seen adults have a variety of responses to looking at the adverse childhood experiences. I can tell you that it's something that we need to be more aware of and kind of reduce the shame and stigma of experiencing those adverse childhood experiences, because they are much more common than society allows us to see. So I just think it's very important that we are aware that those traumas that our children, ourselves, our grandparents, our parents, our great-grandparents have experienced are very common. So now that we know a little bit about those adverse childhood experiences, what can we do to help care for those children who have experienced trauma? What are some ways that we can help support them? So we know that trauma affects a child's behavior, their feelings, their relationships, and view of the world in really profound ways. So let's do a quick trauma in the brain. So we know that in neuroscience, researches that have been done in children that have experienced trauma, the amygdala is much larger in children that have not experienced trauma, okay? So the amygdala is the part of our brain that is the quote unquote smoke alarm of the brain. So the amygdala's job is to sense danger and be responsible to kick us into that flight, fight, or freeze mode, right? So that is what keeps us safe. That's the piece of the brain that has been responsible for keeping us alive over the existence of humans, right? So this is the piece that when you see a bear in the wild, it tells your brain, okay, we need to do something so we can survive. So it kicks us into either flight, fight, or freeze. Hopefully it's the flight, you want to get out of there very quickly. And what it does is it actually causes a physical reaction in our body. Okay, so it's not just mental, it's very physical. It makes us so our muscles are getting more oxygen, the blood's pumping, the heart's working, so that way we can get out and away from that bear. Now, the problem is when children have a larger amygdala, they are constantly in that place, or almost constantly in that place of fight, flight, or freeze. And the amygdala is very good at what it does. So it puts us in survival mode, okay? And when we're in survival mode, the frontal lobe part of our brain, which is responsible for our, the prefrontal cortex, is the part that's responsible for our reasoning, our emotional control, our thinking, right? That part of the brain kind of is overshadowed when our amygdala is really on, okay? Because our brain is not worried about, what does this bear want? It says, we're not going to worry about what the bear wants. We're going to worry about get away from the bear, and then the prefrontal cortex can come back online and tell us, I wonder why I was in that situation. So think about it. Have you been in a frightened situation? Your adrenaline's pumping. How clearly are you thinking in that moment? Not very much, right? So these children that have experienced trauma and have a larger amygdala, they're on alert for danger almost all the time. That's the hypervigilance piece, right? So this can lead to learning difficulties and problems with impulse control. And this is especially true for children, as the prefrontal cortex is actually the last part of our brain to develop until, doesn't fully develop until we're around 24 to 25 years, okay? So one thing that we need to really be conscious of is how the brain chemistry really plays a part into children with trauma, and understand that it may not be it's not a conscious choice for your child to be in an over alert state, or the child you're caring for to be in an over hypervigilant, always looking for fear and danger state. Their brain is doing what it thinks it needs to do to help them survive. So if we come from a place of knowing that, we can come from a place of care and compassion rather than reaction, okay? So we're going to discuss a little bit about the anatomy of PTSD, that post-traumatic stress disorder. All right, so the amygdala stores that stimuli associated with memory. So that's our sights, our sounds, our smells, that sort of thing. So let's say in our bear situation, it smells a little bit animally, you hear the crunching leaves of the bear walking, and you see the brown fur of the bear, okay? And then the amygdala afterwards produces that calming thought, when there's no longer danger, kind of helps us, it releases and lets us get into that relaxed state, okay? So some effects after traumatic stress. So signs and symptoms of PTSD. And again, as always, this is just a very general overview. So that anxiety, that hypervigilance, which is being very, very aware of your surroundings and on alert for danger at all times. So you also may avoid stimuli associated with the trauma. So we talked about our bear and the stimuli that our brain's storing. So you're going to try and avoid that brown hair. You may avoid the sound of the crunching leaves, or that very animal smell, okay? And another sign is that excessive amygdala activity, so being super on alert. So when a person develops PTSD, and our amygdala has stored all those sights, sounds, smells, etc., associated with the event. If one or more of those stimuli are encountered, the amygdala goes, "Oh my God, we're facing the bear again," and sends up that danger signal. Right? It's oh my gosh, we have to fight or freeze. Like it is time. Our life is in danger. That bear is back. Okay. Even if that brown fur is maybe a dog walking by, but it looks very much like that bear. So then so we see that brown fur of the dog, and our amygdala says, okay, time to fight, flight, or freeze, and we react. Even if it's not a bear, we still act like it's a bear. Okay, so we act like we are in danger. The same thing with trauma. If a child experiences trauma and they see, smell, hear, or maybe even taste something that is similar to the traumatic experience. So for another example, rather than just a bear, if they were in a very bad car accident and they hear the squealing of a brake, a car's brake driving by, and they hear that, their brain may react in that flight, fight, or freeze if they have post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, so we're going to talk about the hippocampus. That is essential to memory formation. So when a traumatic event occurs, the hippocampus creates and stores that memory. It retrieves the memory, and then it calms the amygdala alarm circuit. With PTSD, the signs and symptoms with the hippocampus can be confusion, disorientation, reoccurring thoughts, nightmares, or flashbacks, difficulty sleeping, and reduced size of the hippocampus. So, when a person develops PTSD, the hippocampus has a very central role in re-experiencing of the traumatic events. So, for example, a traumatic memory could be involuntarily retrieved when triggered by a stimuli. So, with our bear, if we start hearing that crunch of leaves, perhaps we have a flashback of when we had to run from that bear. Okay, so these memories tend to be very strong, and the hippocampus seems to be overactive with post-traumatic stress disorder. So this combination makes it really easy for these memories to be brought back to our forefront during both times of wakefulness, so being awake, so essentially a flashback, or when we're asleep, reoccurring nightmares, right? So impaired sleep with reoccurring nightmares is among one of the most frustrating symptoms reported by people with PTSD. So the hippocampus can't do its job of calming down the amygdala because the danger your brain is perceiving is being perceived as real. So even if there's not a real danger to that person's life, it very much feels like it's a real life danger. So the prefrontal cortex, that piece up here, right behind our forehead, it's in the frontal lobes. It controls our behavior, emotions, and impulses. After a traumatic event, the prefrontal cortex should let the amygdala know, like, it's okay to calm down once the danger's passed. Okay, so we see a bear. Amygdala goes, oh my gosh, a bear, we gotta run. We run, we calm, and then our prefrontal cortex goes, okay, there's no bear, time to calm down. With PTSD, that prefrontal cortex is not as active, so it's not as able to help us calm down. So some signs may be irritability, withdrawal, so numbing, avoidance, etc., and reduced activity of the prefrontal cortex. So in those with PTSD, it's less active, which likely correlates those signs of social withdrawal, avoidance of reminders of trauma, emotional numbing. Therefore, the prefrontal cortex is unable to override the hippocampus. So when it flashes that memory, the prefrontal cortex is not able to say, nope, not real danger, it's okay, it's just a memory. So that is PTSD, kind of in a small nutshell, right? So we don't have enough time to dive completely into it. This is just kind of an overall snapshot of what's happening in the brain with PTSD and why people who have experienced trauma and have PTSD react the way that they do, even when there's not a real threat, because the brain feels that it's really happening. It's very much real for them, okay? So now that we know a little bit about what trauma is, different types, things that can cause trauma, the anatomy of the brain with post-traumatic stress disorder, what that can present like, what some signs are of trauma, how can we help? What can we do for our children or children in our care who have experienced those adverse childhood experiences, those traumatic events? Well, we can offer a secure base of caring and safety. Let them know that we care and they are safe in our care, okay? We need to be emotionally and physically available. So not just physically present, but emotionally present. We need to recognize and respond to a child's needs. If we notice our child being in a more heightened sense, so we need to recognize and respond to those child's needs. Do they need space? Do they need close contact? Do they need a hug? Do they need extra supports? Can we get them into counseling? Is that something that we need to do? We need to provide guidance and examples. So we need to show them what those healthy coping skills look like. What are ways that we can express those big feelings? What can we do? Often parents and caregivers very much focus on, when you're angry, you can't hit, you can't do this, you can't do that. If we only say the can'ts, what can we do? So maybe when you're feeling really angry and overwhelmed, you and the child can create a calm down corner and allow that child to just be there, have some really good sensory objects, and just let them be so they can calm and regulate. We need to provide opportunities for them to safely explore the world, right? So when a person has experienced a traumatic event, we need to make sure that they are allowed to find ways to explore the world safely. We need to give them that affectionate and love, so that those kiddos learn that they are lovable and they are worthy of love. We need to give them that support and nurture and respond to them. So help them learn that they are capable. And, with those opportunities of exploring the world safely, learn and relearn that the world is safe and there are safe places. So, some myths that we really should avoid as children's caregivers that have experienced trauma. So these are myths. These are not true. So the care that I provide should be enough to erase the effect of everything bad happened before. No, that's not true. We talked about the brain and how it is not a conscious decision. When they see that brown fur, whether it's a bear or a dog, the brain goes, oh my gosh, it's a bear. And it reacts because the brain's doing its job in trying to keep us alive. Another false thing is these children should be grateful and appreciative of everything that I do for them. If they are not in a good place emotionally and mentally, they cannot appreciate that. We need to come with care and compassion, okay? Another false myth is it's just better to move on, forget, and not talk about these past painful experiences, okay? So we know that with the adverse childhood experiences, whether we discuss them or not, they have an impact on our lives. And burying it and putting it down and just pretending it never happened does nobody any good. Now, we also don't need to continually bring up the trauma, but allowing a child a safe space to talk about it if they choose, right? We don't need to rehash it constantly. And I strongly urge you, if you have a child that's been through trauma, please get them professional help. It's important that somebody with the tools and techniques can support you and your child. And depending on the type of trauma, family counseling can be a wonderful tool as well. It's just giving those children those techniques and skills so they can move on and lead a very healthy, happy life. So, some other tips for helping children after a traumatic event is make them feel safe. What is that for them? Are they now scared of the dark? Let's get a nightlight. From toddlers to teens, do they need more hugs, cuddling, reassuring pat on the back? It can give them a really sense of security and safety during the aftermath of the event. Keeping in mind our tone, or perhaps even our choice of words. Is that something that perhaps the perpetrator would say to them? Is that tone a trigger for them? Okay. Be calm. Be calm as possible. When we are regulated, we can help our children regulate themselves and keep those emotions at a better level. Maintaining routines is a really, really great way to support our kiddos. So having those healthy routines, they can reassure children that life will be okay again. So having regular meals and bedtimes, getting a nice routine, help them find ways to enjoy themselves. Encourage them to join activities and play with others. It can really create that sense of normalcy. Pick good times to talk. We also need to be understanding that children cope in different ways. You may see some things. Some might want to spend extra times with their friends and relatives. Some might want to spend time alone. It's important that children understand that it may be normal to experience anger, guilt, sadness, and express things in different ways. For example, a person might feel very sad but not cry. We also need to make sure that we are listening. So zip the lip and just listen. And listen to be fully listening. So that active listening, we really got to make sure that we are doing that. And we are there to just take in what our child is telling us, or that child is telling us, and not just listen to respond. Find some ways to help that child relax. So when a person is anxious, often breathing becomes very shallow. If you start practicing deep belly breaths with your child, that can help them calm. For example, let's breathe in slowly while I count to 3, and then breathe out while I count to 3. Find different ways that work for them, right? So coping skills are not a one-size-fits-all. One person may enjoy breathing, that breathe in for 3, breathe out for 3. For one person, that may be very difficult or triggering even. Maybe they need a comfort item, so one of those nice little weighted stuffed animals to hold and squeeze. You got to find what fits for that child, okay? So acknowledge what that child is feeling. So if a child admits a concern like, I'm scared of the dark, don't respond with, oh, don't be worried, because they may feel embarrassed or criticized. Simply confirm with what you're hearing. I hear that you're scared of the dark. Would getting a nightlight help? Offer suggestions that might help comfort that child. So we're going to talk about a few age-specific ways to help. And again, it's not a hat. It's not a one-size-fits-all. You have to pick what works for that child. But these are some things that you can try. So for ages 0 to 2, really, really big one is making sure that you're regulated. So find a way for you to be calm and relax and present. If you are calm, your baby will feel calm. If you're anxious and overwhelmed, your baby may react with fussing or have trouble being soothed. So respond to that baby's needs. It's our job to care for them in every aspect in this age range. Look into your child's eyes, smile, physical contact. Really just being there helps a infant's emotional balance. So for ages 2 to 5, although they're making those really big developmental advances, they still really depend on parents to nurture them. So, as with babies, they respond to situations according to how you react. Just as when you're a toddler who's first learning to walk, when they fall, if you go, oh, they're probably going to react a little larger, right? But if they fall and you go, oh, good job, good fall, they will react a little bit more positively. Same with trauma, right? We want to make sure that we are regulated as possible, not dismissing, but understanding. For that age group, what can we do? We can hold and hug them as much as possible, as much as they want, right? So use those simple phrases such as, I am here, we are safe. Be aware of the conversations that you're having around them. Little children have big ears. They're great at listening, picking up on your anxiety. They might misinterpret what you're saying. Maintain those routines as much as possible. Give extra support at bedtime. That transition into sleep may be really, really difficult. So children who have been through trauma may be more anxious at night even. So putting them to bed, make sure that you spend a little extra time reading stories or just laying together. Really monitor what media is coming into your home. So having the news on while they are sitting enjoying, maybe wait off on that because that's enough fright and drama that even adults, it has an impact, right? Encourage those kiddos to share their feelings, draw pictures, spin activities together. If your child acts out, it may be a sign that they need some extra attention. Name how they're feeling. Are you feeling scared? Are you feeling angry? What are you feeling? And then show them the appropriate ways that they can do. It's okay to be angry, but it's not okay to hit your sister. You can, however, go stomp your feet or jump on the trampoline. Find those positive ways that they can physically express those feelings. And lastly, talk about things that are going well. What are good things that are happening in the lives right then? Well, I am here with you and I will stay with you. Point out the good and notice the positives. So those are some ways that we can help support our children who have been through some traumatic experiences. Again, it's not an all-exhaustive list. Please know some other things that are really important is to reach out if you're seeing a lot of anxiety or issues. Please reach out to a medical professional, a doctor, a psychologist, a counselor, anything that can help support your child. Make sure that you're getting the supports you need as well, right? A regulated, calm adult can help regulate a child, okay? If we're dysregulated, there's no way that we can help support a child that's also dysregulated. As always, I really hope that this workshop was understanding trauma. It is an overall view of what trauma is, some possible causes, possible signs, and possible ways to help our children. I hope that you've taken away a few good things from this. Please fill out our paperwork. I appreciate your time and I hope you've enjoyed. Thank you.